Good morning, dear friends. Greetings from Germany. Today we will talk about the Evangelistic Sabbath conferences in 1848 and 1849, early 1849. And so this will conclude some of the discussions that we had before and lead up to some of the new topics and the new developments then later on in the 1850s. By this time in the fall of 1847 and early 1848, there was a high interest in the Sabbath. There had been discussions in the Bible Advocate, and in the Bible Advocate during that time, J.B. Cook and Joseph Turner, they debated concerning the Sabbath. Cook argued in favor of the seventh-day Sabbath, so he said that this Sabbath is the seventh day, or Saturday is the seventh day, and Joseph Turner, he argued that Sunday is the seventh day. Now, while they debated this topic, as I said, there was a lot of interest in the subject in and of itself. However, Joseph Bates, James White, and Ellen White, they were excluded from that debate. They could not publish any articles in this periodical, and so they could not participate and provide input from their perspective to that debate. And so they were looking for ways how they could promote their own understanding of the Sabbath truth. That's why those debates and the rise of interest in the subject allowed for them to engage in a more aggressive promotion of the Sabbath truth. It is at this time that a change took place. You could say a paradigm shift in a certain way. Before, from 1845 to 1846, maybe 1847, the time can be characterized as the scattering time. Ellen White refers to the scattering time in her book, the Early Writings. But it's at this time now, in 1847, fall 1847, moving towards 1848, that Ellen White referred to that time no longer as the scattering time, the scattering of the believers, the dividing up of the Millerite movement, but she referred to the time as the gathering time. So at this point that a leadership had been established, and the leaders of this Sabbatarian Adventist movement were Joseph Bates, James White, and Ellen White. So leadership had been established, as well as a doctrinal foundation had been provided, the doctrinal foundation of the present truth. So these had been established, and so the movement was ready to grow. The scattering time was over, the gathering time was about to begin. And so Joseph Bates, James White, and Ellen White wanted to proclaim the Sabbath more fully. And so they began to organize a couple conferences in different places, and where they could share the Sabbath truth or their newly discovered insights, debate and discuss with the believers, and gather those different scattered groups of believers. So those conferences are referred to as the Evangelistic Sabbath conferences, which took place in the fall of 1847, from September 1847 to the summer and fall of 1848. These conferences provided a way to share the present truth and gather previously scattered believers, and as a second result, they provided an opportunity to study and develop then also the sealing message, which happened more at the end. So initially there were conferences that took place in the East, in Connecticut, and so there were conferences in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, in September 1847, and again in April 1848. So concerning the conference that took place in April in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, at this meeting there were some opposing views that were presented, and in the end Ellen White, however, had a vision concerning the Sabbath, and she shared what she saw in the vision, and it seems that the vision caused unity and brought the believers together. So the meeting was a success. Later on, in the summer of 1848, the Whites and the Bates, they moved towards the west. I mean, they didn't move, but they traveled towards the west. And so several meetings took place in New York. The first one took place in Volney, New York. And at this meeting, when the meeting started out, there was a lot of confusion. There were different views that were presented. Some views that were just very random. And there was a spirit of discussion prevalent. Up to a point when, again, Ellen White had a vision. And when she came out of the vision, she shared what she had seen. And the entire congregation was deeply affected. And so the meeting was a success. So far, at this point, no new views had been presented. It was basically what they had discovered before concerning the Sabbath, concerning the third angel's message, and the sanctuary doctrine and so on. So, if you want to look at the different views that had been presented and developed up to this point, you can look into the lecture outline handbook on pages 114 and 115. There you have a list of the different views that had been discovered up to this point and then presented at those conferences in the East and in the West. It was not until the fall of 1848 that the sealing message was then proclaimed and or discovered and then also proclaimed. So, as we moved into the fall of 1848, conferences also took place again in the East. So the Whites initially had conferences in the East, in Connecticut, then in the West in New York, and then they came back to the East and had meetings in Connecticut, September 1848, in Maine in October 1848, and then Massachusetts in November 1848. We don't really know as much what happened at the Connecticut meeting in September, but we know a few things that happened at the Maine meeting. And one thing that we see happening at this time is that they discovered more that the Sabbath was the seal of God. So this view developed in the fall of 1848 and into early 1849 and expanded the eschatological importance of the Sabbath and why it was necessary to proclaim the Sabbath. The meeting that took place in Massachusetts in November 1848 took place in Dorchester, Massachusetts. The sealing message specifically the sealing message that was presented at this meeting and also at the following meetings. It was also at this meeting that Ellen White had a vision, and we refer to this vision as the streams of light vision, where she was shown that this message and that the Sabbath as part of this message would be proclaimed more fully, and that her husband, James White, should start a little paper that would start little or small and then would go all around the world. At this point in 1848, they didn't have the finances to start such a paper, but by the summer of 1849, James White began to publish The Present Truth, a little periodical which had the purpose to promote the newly discovered truths, and they refer to those truths as present truth. In 1850, so 1 year later, or less than 1 year later, James White began to publish another periodical. It was called the Advent Review, and it was the purpose of that periodical to review the Millerite experience. So while the Present Truth promoted the newly discovered truth, the Advent Review reviewed and looked back at the Millerite experience and repeated some of the insights that they had made during the Millerite movement. Shortly afterwards, he then merged those two papers, and a new paper developed that basically had both or combined both purposes, and he called this periodical the Second Advent Review and the Sabbath Herald. So it reviewed the Millerite experience, and it also highlighted the newly discovered truth. This periodical is then briefly referred to as the Review and Herald. Coming back to the Dorchester meeting in Massachusetts, we can say that the meeting had a twofold significance. First, it provided a further opportunity for the discussion of the concept of the Sabbath and the seal of God. And second, it provided a basis for a more extensive publishing ministry. Thank you very much for listening. At this point, I would recommend to you to look at the chapter in the lecture outline handbook concerning the Evangelistic Sabbath conferences in 1848 and 1849 to acquaint yourself with the details. Otherwise, I wish you all the best, and I'm looking forward to see you again next week on Tuesday. Bye-bye.